Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Simple Lessons to Improve Your Law Practice and Your Life, presented by Nora Bergman. My name is Stephanie Phelan. I'm a marketing manager at MyCase, and I will be your host today. I first wanted to thank everyone for your understanding and your kind words when we were unable to record this webinar live last week. Nora lost power due to Hurricane Irma, but her power has been restored and she's back in action. Our format will be a little different this time since we don't have a live audience, but we also don't want you to miss out on the chance to win an Apple gift card. So when we send the email to registrants, we will include a survey and draw the winner from the survey respondents. If you'd like to join the conversation on Twitter, the hashtag to use for this presentation is #LessonsForLawyers. This webinar has been approved by the Wyoming State Bar and the Florida Bar for 1 hour of general CLE credit. If you're a Florida Bar member, note course number 2733R to self-report your CLE. Please note we do not provide certificates for this webinar. Today's webinar is hosted by MyCase, so before we jump into things, I'd like to give you a quick overview. MyCase is affordable, intuitive, and powerful legal practice management software designed for the modern law firm. Our web-based software takes care of your daily practice requirements for calendaring, contact management, document management and templates, time and billing, client communications, custom workflows, and more in one solution at a really affordable price. MyCase is priced for solo and small firms at just $39 a month per user. We also offer MyCase websites for our customers. The one-time fee to set up and build your custom website is $9.95. Then there's a $50 per month fee to host, maintain, and update your website. Our websites team makes some really beautiful websites, and they can build one for your law firm too. We use a modern, professional design built for your firm. The websites contain social media and blog integration, and best of all, a client portal, which is completely integrated with your MyCase software. So now you and your customers can log into MyCase directly from your website. Next up is payments. Are you accepting payments from clients online yet? If not, don't worry, it's easier than ever. MyCase now has a built-in credit card payments feature for our payment service. MyCase customers can accept online payments from clients using both credit cards and checking accounts seamlessly through their MyCase account with no third-party integration required. Last but not least, we enjoy hosting educational events for professionals in the legal industry, and that's why we're all here today. So let me tell you a little bit about our presenter. Nora Bergman has been a certified practice advisor with Atticus since 2006. She's a law firm business coach at Real Life Practice and the author of 50 Lessons for Lawyers. Earn more, stress less, be awesome. She understands the challenges lawyers face in all aspects of law practice management from the inside out. As a law firm coach, Nora draws her experiences both as a lawyer and a musician. She grew up in Fort Lauderdale and played guitar in a lot of clubs back in the 70s and 80s. One night she was playing at the Bahia Mar Resort singing a Jimmy Buffett song. He was a big deal at the time in Florida. She was singing Volcano, and there was this commotion at the back of the bar. It was Jimmy Buffett who had just docked his boat in the marina and came into the club for a drink. A highlight for sure. She continued to play at clubs through her first year of law school and still joins in with friends who play. We're lucky to have such a well-rounded coach to help us look around and reassess what's working and what's not in our law practice. Nora, I'll pass the mic over to you now and let you take it from here.
Thank you, Stephanie, so very much. Thanks for that kind introduction and reminding me of my days as a lounge singer with Jimmy Buffett. And thank you to everybody for your understanding about the hurricane that we just went through here in Florida. We're through it. As Stephanie said, we're up and running on the other side, and all is well. And for any folks that did suffer damages or problems from Hurricane Irma, sending you wishes and good thoughts that you get everything back up and running wherever you may be in Florida or elsewhere listening to us this afternoon. So with that, let's kind of jump in. Before we talk about the lessons specifically, I have a question for you. Are you living your life, or is your life living you? This is your life, and you should be living your life, not the other way around. All too often, I think lawyers actually find out, and let me even step back from that just a moment. Not just lawyers, so many of us, we are lived by our lives. We're not making the kinds of conscious choices about how to live our life that we can. So I always start with this question. It's actually the very first lesson in the book. Because if you don't understand, as the Annie Dillard quote says there, how we spend our days is, of course, how we spend our lives, then you'll always be lived by your life and not the other way around. You know, I've given this presentation several different times. It's always a little bit different every time I talk about it. And today, this ampersand has a whole new meaning for me. I think about ampersands a lot when it comes to how we live our lives, because with an ampersand, there is always something before the ampersand and then something after the ampersand. And in our lives, we have lots of ampersands. We have some really wonderful ampersands. Getting married, having children, whatever joy brings to you in your life, you have those moments that are before the event and then after the event. And sometimes those ampersands are not fun. And we just went through one. I think in Florida, we're going to have the before Irma and after Irma ampersand. I hope that this webinar, in some small way, is an ampersand for you. That you can actually take what we talk about today and begin to apply it in your life immediately, so that there will be before the MyCase webinar and after the MyCase webinar. And hopefully the after is going to bring some very positive changes to your life and to your practice. But it's up to you. It's up to you to make the days different. I want to share with you a story. Stephanie mentioned that I'm a practice advisor with Atticus, and the founder of Atticus is a man named Mark Powers. And Mark likes to tell the story of the lawyer who comes to the office and says, "Today will be different." As that lawyer walks up to the office, he puts his hand on the doorknob and says, "Today will be different. Today, I am going to work through my to-do list. I'm going to get everything on my to-do list done. I'm going to have that sense of accomplishment. I'm going to find time to market my practice, because I know I need to be doing that to be effective and to be successful. I'm going to spend time with my team. I'm going to mentor that associate that I have. I'm going to work with my paralegal. I'm going to get my work done, and I'm going to leave the office at 6 o'clock, and I'm going to go home and I'm going to have dinner with my family." And at 7:30, that lawyer is still sitting at his desk looking at that to-do list that is not done and saying, "Well, tomorrow will be different." That is a painful reality for far too many lawyers. And so the lessons that we're going to cover today will give you some new strategies, I hope, to think about how you can make today a different day for you. Now, I said new strategies, but quite honestly, I think some of the things I'm going to be talking about over the next hour, they're not new, first of all. They're not solely my ideas. A lot of these ideas have been around for a long time. The distinction is, you may already know a lot of what I'm talking about and I'm going to talk about. The question is, are you doing these things? Are you doing these things? Because understanding something, knowing something, and actually doing that thing are very, very different perspectives. So in order for today to be different or tomorrow to be different for you, I have a challenge for you, and that is, choose at least one of the lessons that I'm going to talk about today and actually start doing it today. Not tomorrow, not next week, not when you get a new computer or something else happens. Start right now, because there is tremendous power in action and actually doing those things that you want to do. So pick one thing and actually start doing it. So what's the first lesson? The first lesson is TANSTATM, my acronym for there ain't no such thing as time management. And that is so, so true. I use the phrase, I'm sure you use the phrase, we're all kind of caught up in the idea of time management, but the truth is that we do not manage time, we only manage ourselves around the time that we've got. I love this quote from Henry David Thoreau because it is so true. I talk to so many lawyers that when I say, how are you doing? Oh, I'm busy. Busy is good. Well, busy is good, yes, if you're busy about the right things. You want to make sure that if you're busy, you're actually busy doing the right things. And in order to be busy doing the right things, you got to know what the right things are. And you have to understand why it's important to manage yourself around time and understand that you can't really manage the time itself. And I want to talk to you a little bit about why that's important, not just from a practice perspective, not just from a legal perspective, but a perspective about you and your health and your well-being. There's been a lot of research recently about how much overwork can hurt us, and I thought this was a particularly compelling statistic from health.com. People who work more than 10 hours a day are about 60% more likely to develop heart disease or have a heart attack than people who clock just 7 hours a day, people who work just 7 hours a day. So think about that. How many lawyers do you know that work 10 hours a day? You might be one of them. Maybe 10 hours is a short day for you. We're part of a profession that wears working long hours like a badge of honor. I haven't practiced for a number of years, but I know when I practice, and I think it is still true, that lawyers often brag about being the last one to leave the office or coming in on the weekends. Maybe coming in on the weekends because that's when you can really get your work done, when things are quiet and you can work. I think there's another reason why lawyers work long hours, sometimes longer than they need to. And that's the idea of adrenaline addiction. A man named Patrick Lencioni, who wrote a book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, has written a really interesting article on adrenaline addiction. And I think a lot of lawyers suffer from this addiction. And it's really insidious, in Lencioni's words, because of the way it shows itself. So I want to read you just a brief excerpt from the article that Lencioni wrote on adrenaline addiction and see if any of this sounds familiar to you. There is something particularly insidious about adrenaline addiction that makes it hard for many leaders to kick the habit. Unlike other addicts, whose behaviors are socially frowned upon, adrenaline addicts are often praised for their frantic activity, even promoted for it during their careers. And so they often wear their problem like a badge of honor, failing to see it as an addiction in spite of all the pain that it causes. And when confronted about their problem, adrenaline addicts will tell you about their endless list of responsibilities and all the people who need their attention. And while they'll often complain about their situation, they'll quickly brush off any constructive advice from spouses, friends, or coworkers as people who just don't understand. So if you see even a glimmer of that in you, I want to really encourage you to start taking that adrenaline addiction seriously and begin to take steps to manage yourself around time more effectively. And let me just say this about adrenaline. You know, adrenaline is one of the most powerful substances in our body. It is there to help us through emergencies, through those fight or flight situations. It is meant to be used in very short bursts. You know, back a million years ago when tigers were chasing us across the savannah, adrenaline helped us either outrun those tigers or fight those tigers. But in any event, the adrenaline was not going to be pumping for a long time because we're either going to get away from the tiger or we're going to be killed by the tiger. But now we have stressors that press upon us for hours and days and weeks, and it is not healthy to have adrenaline pumping through your system 24/7, 7 days a week. So what can you do if you are suffering from a case of adrenaline addiction? My suggestion is that you start thinking in terms of how you view your life. So there is a concept called locus of control. It was first articulated by a psychologist back in the 1950s, and it's a relatively simple concept. Perhaps not as simple to apply to your life, but simple to understand for sure. So as human beings, we either have an external locus of control or an internal locus of control. The difference is that for someone who has an external locus of control, your worldview is kind of like things happen to you. They happen to you. Some of the language of an external locus of control is that others control my destiny. There's really nothing I can do. I had no choice. Why bother? You know, everything always happens to me. That sense of having really no control over your life. On the other hand, someone who has an internal locus of control is the opposite of that, if you will. Someone with an internal locus of control knows that you can make things happen. You can control your destiny. You can determine your future. You can choose how to respond in any given situation. The concept of these two different approaches or viewpoints toward life can make a tremendous difference in how you are able to manage yourself around the time that you've got. Your mindset, how you choose to respond to something is incredibly powerful in your life. When I was a young lawyer back in the 90s, I read a book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. If you've never read it, I highly recommend it. My man name's Stephen Covey. In that book, I read a quote that really changed my life, and it was a quote from a man named Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was a psychologist in World War II, and he was a Jewish psychologist in Germany. He survived a concentration camp, and after his experience in the camp, he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, another fantastic book I would highly recommend to you. Dr. Frankl noticed in his experience in the concentration camp that those people who survived were people who made a conscious choice during their time in the camp to help other people, to somehow find the good in a situation that seemed, from all intents and purposes, to have absolutely nothing good in it or about it. They made a conscious choice how they were going to respond to that situation. The quote that I read in Stephen Covey's book from Dr. Frankl said that between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies our freedom to choose. And in that space lies our growth and freedom. So we've got the ability to make some really conscious choices about how we spend our time, how we use our time, how we respond to situations. And those choices can make a tremendous impact, not only on our effectiveness and our productivity at the office and how we take care of our clients and how we are as lawyers, but how we are as people and the quality of our lives. So think about the concept of locus of control and where you fit along that continuum, whether your locus of control is more internal or external. And maybe it was Dr. Seuss who said it best. You have brains in your head, you have feet in your shoes, you can steer yourself in any direction you choose. That is an example of an internal locus of control. So how do you get a more internal locus of control if it's healthier for you to have this sense of being able to control your own destiny? What do you do to get that? Well, one simple thing you can begin doing is to begin living in your calendar, to start taking control of your calendar. This is a huge thing to get for lawyers. Most lawyers that I talk to don't live in their calendar. They live in their inbox, constantly reacting to emails, constantly reacting as opposed to being proactive. So you can increase your internal locus of control, increase your sense of control, increase your ability to manage yourself around time more effectively by simply taking control of yourself around time and managing your calendar. It sounds almost paradoxical. How do you get more of something you don't have? You get more of something you don't have by getting more of something you don't have. And I don't mean to make light of it, but I'm suggesting that you start being very conscious about the time that is in your calendar. If you look at this slide, you're looking at a concept called a time template that Atticus uses. So you have a color-coded calendar. There is time in this example for you to return phone calls, to meet with clients, to take depositions, to actually do the work that you need to do that surrounds your law practice, rather than just reactively responding to what is in your inbox. You can, if you use Outlook as your email client, you can choose how it starts up in the morning. Don't start up in your inbox, start up in your calendar. And by the way, that phrase, live in your calendar, which I love, I stole that from a guy named Dan Markovitz, who wrote another wonderful book that I would totally recommend to you called The Factory of One. Great, great book. So start increasing your locus of control by taking more control of your calendar. The more you take control of your calendar, the more you will be able to increase that locus of control. So to live the lesson, it's simply a matter of changing your mindset. And I say simply, and simple doesn't mean easy necessarily, right? Stop thinking about time management and start thinking in terms of self-management. Manage yourself to increase that internal locus of control. Change the talk in your head so that you understand that you are in control of your life. Begin to live in your calendar, not in your inbox. Lesson number 2, and this kind of leads into lesson number 1 almost. Get in the habit of planning. So when you begin to make planning a habit, you will be able to take more control of your calendar. Again, you are the person that can slowly begin to take control of that calendar by looking ahead. And if you don't, to share another quote with you, things which matter most must never be at the mercy of things which matter least. If you're not planning, if you're not taking control of your calendar, I can guarantee you that the things which matter most in your life, your health, your family, to some extent, the clients that you serve, are going to be at the mercy of those things which matter least. So when I talk about planning, let me just talk generally about the concept of planning. As you look at your calendar, pick some period of time, about 30 minutes. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a moment, but if you spend 30 minutes a week planning the coming week, there's some research that shows that the return on investment for planning can be up to 3 to 1. So just by sitting down and thinking through your plan for the week, you may actually recoup 3 times the amount of time that you've invested. And the kind of planning I'm talking about is essentially what Tony Schwartz, the author of The Way We're Working Isn't Working, refers to as pre-deciding. Pre-deciding really helps a person protect that goal, protect that thing you want to do from other kinds of distractions, bad habits, competing goals, someone else's priority that is not your priority. You know, if it is a goal of yours not to eat ice cream at 11 o'clock at night before you go to bed, then you can make a pre-decision to not have ice cream in your freezer, right? I mean, that is what planning is all about. So let me pause here for just a moment. Stephanie, ask if you have any questions.
So Nora, I do have a question. Yeah. So isn't it true that even if I plan, I may not be able to execute my plan? And if so, what happens then? How would I adjust to that?
Okay. Oh, great question. Yes. Very often when you plan, you're not going to be able to execute your plan exactly as you want to. There's an old saying, I think it's a military saying, that says, no plan survives contact with the enemy. And in your law firm, that enemy shows up in lots of different ways. That enemy can be a client, it can be your staff, it can be a judge. Anything that shows up to interfere with your plan is the enemy.
It could be ice cream. Yeah.
It could be ice cream. It could totally be ice cream. So yes, that's going to happen. But here's the way our mind works. Having made some pre-decisions, having taken the time to actually think through what you want to do, when the enemy shows up, even though you might not feel it, you are somewhat prepared for that enemy to show up because you've already thought through what you want to do. Again, sounds like a bit of a paradox, but that's the way our brains work. So the actual act of planning, it's almost like visualization. You know, every great athlete on the planet visualizes success, visualizes what it looks like when you shoot that perfect free throw in basketball, pick your sport, whatever it looks like, they rehearse it in their mind until it becomes a reality for them. Planning works very much the same way for us as lawyers. You're kind of making some pre-decisions and you're rehearsing in your mind. So how do you live the lesson? So here are just some simple steps you can take if you're not already doing some weekly planning. Schedule 30 minutes in your calendar to plan. Include your key support person, whether that's an associate or a paralegal, or maybe an associate and a paralegal. And if it's just you, that's fine. But here's the key part, and here's what I mean when I say live in your calendar. Schedule time in your calendar during the coming week to actually do the work associated with the deadlines and due dates that are coming up for you. So when you're planning, sit down with your calendar and look out 2, 3, 4 weeks. Look for deadlines, look for due dates, and then come back to the coming week and look for places in your calendar where there are open spots and actually plug in time to do the work. So for example, you know, you have a motion for summary judgment that's due 2 weeks from Friday, and you have chunks of time in the coming week that are not yet filled with appointments, and perhaps the week after that. So you can work on that motion for summary judgment or whatever it might be for your law practice in a productive and effective way that takes control of your calendar. And by the way, when you work in short little spurts rather than working on a deadline when a deadline is pressing down upon you, your work is going to be much better because our brains are more effective when we can work in a focused way and then step away from something and just kind of let it sit there and then come back to it. And if you're adrenaline addicted and you're always working up against a deadline, you don't have the luxury of working on something for a little bit of time and then stepping away from it and coming back to it and actually creating a better work product. So I mentioned the idea of a time template, and that is a concept that Atticus talks with our clients a lot about, and that is to simply plug into your calendar to the extent that you can. You know, for example, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 1 to 3 in the afternoon, this is my production time. I'm not going to have client appointments here. I'm not going to be interrupted during this time. This is the time I'm going to be able to spend on the work that I actually need to do that's associated with the deadlines and the due dates in my calendar. So some of you are probably thinking, I don't know how in the world I'm going to do that. And in order to be able to do that, lesson number 3 tells us that you must learn to manage needless interruptions or you'll never be able to focus on anything. And unfortunately, I think nowadays, most of us, not just lawyers, we all suffer from a bit of self-induced ADD. We are constantly bombarded. When I first started practicing, it was all about email, you know. When I first started coaching over 10 years ago, the focus was really on email interruptions. But now we have email, we have updates, we have sports scores coming in, we have stock tickers coming in, we have Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. It is a constant bombardment on our brain. And truth is, we try to pay attention to everything. It's very, very difficult to pay attention to anything. You know, when everything is important, nothing is important. And you may notice this in yourself, that it's very hard to stay focused on anything for any length of time. And that is due to, at least in some part, the number of interruptions that we deal with throughout the day. People that study this stuff tell us that the average knowledge worker, and of course that is every attorney, is interrupted every 8 minutes with something. And here's another statistic that is just blows my mind when I think about it. It can take your brain up to 20 minutes to recover from an interruption. And this is research from the most recent neuroscience, where they can do brain scans and actually study this kind of stuff. So when I say it can take your brain up to 20 minutes to recover from an interruption, I'm talking about actually stopping whatever you were doing when you were interrupted, dealing with the interruption, whatever it might be, whether it's an email that catches your attention, whether it's a staff person standing in your doorway, or another lawyer standing in your doorway waiting to ask you a question, whatever it might be, dealing with that interruption, and then coming back to what you were working on. Up to 20 minutes for your brain. So when you think about the math with respect to that 20 minutes, if you're dealing with just 3 needless interruptions a day, and I'm really focusing on needless interruptions, and I'm going to make that distinction for you in just a moment. A needless interruption 3 times a day adds up to 1 hour a day, and over a 48-week year, that's 240 hours, or 6 40-hour weeks that could be lost to interruptions.
So, Nora, yeah. Can I interject there? So, sure. Speaking of interruptions, what if the work I'm being interrupted for is billable, even if it's not an emergency?
Okay, good point. It could be billable work, absolutely. If it's not an emergency, Stephanie, thank you very much, because you led me wonderfully into my next slide. This is a statistic from a book called Brain Rules. I know I throw a lot of books out in the presentations that I do. This book is fantastic. I would say that it is required reading for every lawyer. It is an excellent book because it talks about how our brains work. Written by a molecular biologist who understands brain stuff, but he's a wonderful writer. And if you get the book and you're into audiobooks, I would highly recommend an audiobook because he reads his book and he's very entertaining. I digress. Studies show that a person who is interrupted takes 50% longer to accomplish a task. Not only that, he or she makes up to 50% more errors. So even if that work that you're being interrupted with is billable, the likelihood is you're going to have some problems with getting that work done. Now, and the other thing I want you to think about when I talk about interruptions, it is a two-way street, because you're very often the person who's the interrupter, perhaps interrupting your paralegal or your assistant or your associate when they're trying to get work done. So it's like a hydra. Interruptions are prevalent in every law firm I have ever worked with, and they're prevalent not up and down the chain, whether it's assistant to attorney or attorney back down. And the other thing about being interrupted with work that might even be billable is that the nature of it, very often you may forget to bill for it. And see if that's not true for yourself. You get interrupted with something, you deal with that interruption, you want to get back to what you're doing, and you completely forget to even make note of what you're interrupted with. So there's just a much, much more effective way to work, and that is to really strive to limit needless interruptions. So when I talk about needless interruptions, I mean those things that are not real true emergencies that you have to deal with. Things that could be dealt with at another time. The idea of creating a time template where you would put into your calendar production time, where you would not be interrupted. When I say not interrupted during production time, I mean that you will not be interrupted with needless interruptions, things that are not emergencies. And you get to determine what emergencies are. And here's what I mean by that. Let's say you have a couple hours in the afternoon blocked off as production time. That means you are not to be interrupted unless that interruption is something that you have identified as important enough, emergent enough to interrupt you. Maybe that's a call from a judge. Maybe that's a call from opposing counsel on the very matter that you're working on in that production time. Maybe it's an emergency with your children or family. Maybe it's a call from one of your best referral sources or an A+ client whose call you always take. My point is that that is a small, short list, and don't leave your team guessing at whether or not they should be able to interrupt you. You need to, again, take control of that and let them know, when I'm in production time, these are the calls that I will take. These are the things that you can interrupt me for. If it's not on this list, it will wait until I am out of my production time. So how do you start to get even more of an idea of control over needless interruption? You have to begin by noticing where they're coming from. So I recommend that you keep an interruption log. And here's what I mean by that. You can do this on a legal pad. If you would like an actual interruption log that we use at Atticus, I can send you one if you email me or reach out to me after this webinar. The goal of an interruption log is to start understanding and noticing where your interruptions are coming from. So what I ask you to do is to keep that log for 3 days. They don't have to be consecutive days. And in that log, you're going to note whether interruptions are internal or external. Let me explain what I mean by that. And I'll start first with external. An external interruption is a phone call coming in that you weren't expecting. Someone walking into your office unannounced to ask you a question. It could be an email, it could be a text. Those are external interruptions. They're coming in, they're acting on you. What are internal interruptions? Internal interruptions are, you can think of them in terms of distractions almost. And I hate to tell you this, but things like emails and texts are both external and internal, because sometimes you ever had a situation where you're kind of working on something, but you're a little bored with it, and you go check your email just to see what's going on, or you check your text, or you go to Facebook. Those are both external and internal because you're distracting yourself. Note external or internal. Note time of day. When did this interruption occur? What time of day did it occur? How long did it last for you? Was it a true emergency, or was it something I would call a needless interruption? And pay attention to when these interruptions are happening throughout the day. You might begin to notice some patterns, especially with internal interruptions. You may notice that every day at 3 o'clock, you are either checking email or you're going to the kitchen to get something to drink. Well, your body may be telling you that you need a break at that time. So pay attention to those cues. Notice those things. And if you have writer's cramp by 10 o'clock in the morning on the first day that you're keeping an interruption log, you're probably dealing with too many needless interruptions. But you can learn a lot from that log. And you can learn a lot about where your interruptions are coming from. And by noticing that, begin to really start taking control. Again, I keep coming back to that word control. And I've talked about the last bullet point here on this slide, to schedule focus time when you're not going to be interrupted, unless that interruption is something that you have identified in advance as being okay to interrupt you for. Lesson number 4, put an end to lurk and blurt. This is another kind of interruption, by the way. The phrase lurk and blurt, I first heard, again, I'm going to come back to Atticus for a moment. Mark Powers was the first person I heard use this term, and it is so descriptive. I absolutely love it. Lurk and blurt happens in every law firm. You know what it looks like. You're sitting there talking on the phone to one of your most important clients, and out of the corner of your eye, you see your paralegal who's standing in your doorway with a file, and you try to ignore her, but she stays there, and now you are distracted by her. And the next time you look over, maybe you make eye contact, and she just kind of mouths, "I just need 1 minute," and she's very persistent because she has an important question. And so you finish your phone call with your client, and before you can write a note or make a time entry, in she comes or in he comes to ask the question that they need to have answered, and you answer that question, and you forget to make notes about your call, or you forget to enter your time about your call, and you're off to the next thing. That is what lurk and blurt looks like. And again, it's a form of interruption, and it happens in both directions in a law firm, because there are many times, I'm sure, when you might wander out to your secretary's desk or your paralegal's desk and do the lurk and blurt to that person. So this occurs across the board in just about every law firm I've worked with. And then sometimes you have the lurk and blurt where your assistant or associate or person you work with isn't coming into your office to interrupt you, but they might be chasing you to your car when you're leaving, or following you to the restroom to ask you a question, or chasing you down the hall to ask a question. Because the people that you work with, your team needs access to you. And when they don't know when they're going to get access to you to answer their questions, then they're going to interrupt you whenever they have a question. And that is a very unproductive way to work for you and for them. So the simplest strategy that I have to put an end to lurk and blurt is to utilize something we call huddles. You might have heard the term stand-up meetings, because that is exactly what they are. They are short meetings that are designed to give your team access to you to answer questions that they have, and for everybody on the team that is involved in the huddle to understand what other people in the team are doing. So there are a variety of different ways that you can implement this idea of huddles or stand-up meetings. I suggest to my clients that you experiment with ideas. The ideas that I'm throwing out today, the lessons that we're talking about today, are things that I would encourage you to experiment with. I said at the top of the webinar, pick one thing and do it, and it will make a dramatic difference in your life and your practice. So when I say do it, I want you to experiment with ways that make it work for you, because there are lots of different ways to implement this idea of a huddle or a stand-up meeting that allow you to give access to your team to ask you questions. So here's what I mean. I have clients who actually have 2 huddles a day. One in the morning at around 11:30 before lunchtime to answer questions that come up in the morning, and another one in the afternoon, 3:30 or so in the afternoon, to answer questions that come up in the afternoon, to deal with issues that might need to be dealt with before the end of the day. Again, short meetings, ideally at the same time, if you can, same time, same place, every day. But that's not going to work for everybody. I have other clients that do huddles only in the afternoon. I have some clients that do huddles on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I encourage it every day, but at least a regular time of day or day during the week, throughout the week, at least 3 a week. But I would highly encourage you to experiment with doing them 3 times, excuse me, every day, once a day at least, every day. And just experiment with it. It's going to feel perhaps odd or different or uncomfortable to you if you've never had these kind of meetings before. But if you stick with it, I truly believe you'll see the benefit of it. So there's one other component that comes along with huddles. If you're having a huddle at 11:30 in the morning, you're having a huddle at 3:30 in the afternoon, that means that your team, the staff people that you're huddling with, need to get in the habit of batching their questions. Here's what I mean by that. If your paralegal knows that at 11:30 every morning she's going to have access to you to answer the questions that she has, then she will need to then get in the habit of batching her questions so that if she's working on a project, comes to a question, knows she's going to see you at 11:30, that question gets put on the list to ask at 11:30, and we move on to the next thing in the stack. So that it doesn't impede that person's ability to work. She knows she's going to have her question answered. She knows she's not going to be interrupting you all day long with questions. But she has the security, or he has the security of knowing they're going to have access to you. And that is important. And you owe it to your team to give them that access. And once they have that access, then their desire to interrupt you all day long with questions is slowly going to diminish. So there are some just general ground rules around creating this idea of huddling. Ideally, again, I would recommend it every day. The huddle is a short meeting. It is not a meeting where you go over a case in depth. If something requires a more in-depth or detailed conversation, that is a meeting to be set aside for another time, not during the huddle. Be brief, be on time, be prepared, be ready for the huddle, 10 minutes max. I actually have a client who sets a timer. When that timer goes off, the huddle is over. It's kind of painful when you first start doing it because you rarely feel like you get everything answered, but it starts to set that expectation that the idea is to be prepared, be on time, and be brief and be gone. 3 questions I suggest for the huddle. What are the top 3 things you're working on today? This gives you, as the attorney, the opportunity to reprioritize work if you need to. Question number 2, are there any obstacles in your way to getting that work done? An obstacle might be a question that needs to be answered, but it could be other things. It could be information that they don't have. It could be any number of things. And then what specific questions have you brought to the huddle? You can customize the questions. You can customize the concept in any way you want. The idea is that consistent access to you to answer questions so that needless interruptions are dramatically reduced throughout the day. Okay. Final lesson. Take a break, for crying out loud. You know, there is, again, tremendous amount of research, you've probably read it, that talks about how dangerous it is for us to sit for any length of time. Sitting is hazardous to our health, apparently. As human beings, we weren't really designed to sit for 8 or 10 hours a day. If you have a stand-up desk, I commend you. If you don't have a stand-up desk, there are things that you can do throughout the day to give yourself a break. And by the way, if you are sitting at your desk all day long, you are increasing your risk for a variety of different cancers, for heart disease, for other kinds of health issues. So get up and take a break. I recommend it, and I think most doctors recommend it, every 30 minutes. Don't sit without moving for longer than 30 minutes. Get up and move. Change your view, and by that I mean if you're staring at a computer screen, just look away, even if it's only for 30 seconds or a minute. By the way, yes, these breaks every 30 minutes can be very short, a minute, to get up and move. Change your view by either looking out the window, looking at pictures of loved ones in your office, something that makes you smile, something that makes you feel good, and give your eyes a bit of a break from the computer. Sip some ice water, because ice water can help you burn calories through the day as your body tries to heat up that ice water. Add some humor, add some inspiration. If you enjoy watching a funny YouTube video, go for it. Our minds work best when we're in a positive state of mind. Again, there's a lot of brain research on this idea of how our state of mind and our level of positivity affects our brain's ability to think creatively and think outside the box. And I think that's a pretty important quality for a lawyer to have, to be able to think creatively. The more positive and open we are, the more creative we can be. So laugh. Don't be afraid of some humor or inspiration. And deepen and relax your breathing. Even if it's only 10 deep breaths, can make a tremendous difference in your mindset, how you feel, and how effective you are. And so, speaking of deepening and relaxing your breathing, that kind of takes me to the very last thing I want to talk with you about, and that is the idea of mindfulness. There has been a lot written about mindfulness over the last couple of years. If you live in Florida, you know that our bar here, it has just created a committee that is going to spend some of its time focusing on the value of mindfulness. I believe that it is the one thing that can truly change so many other things in our life. I talked earlier in this presentation about the Viktor Frankl quote, that we have the ability to choose how we respond to a situation. In that space between stimulus and response lies our growth and freedom. If we're not able to notice those spaces between our thoughts, it's not as easy for us to make conscious choices about how we're going to behave and what we're going to do. If we're not noticing where our interruptions are coming from, because we're so caught up in the crazy busyness of it all, we're not going to be able to make changes around how we manage ourselves as opposed to managing time. So mindfulness is about understanding our thoughts, noticing our thoughts. It's not about spirituality unless you want it to be. It's not about sitting cross-legged on the floor in the lotus position unless you want it to be. I know I'm talking to lawyers, so I want to talk about science again for just a moment. And again, how our brains work. And let me recommend one more book to you. It's called Your Brain at Work by a man named David Rock. Fascinating book. And in that book, he talks about the two networks that we have in our brain. All of us have something called the default network or the narrative network and the direct action network. And one of those two networks in our brains is at work at any one time. The default network is where we spend most of our time. The default network is that network in our brain that allows us to think about the future, to reminisce about the past. It allows us to plan. It also allows us to worry. It's the constant voice inside of our head that is talking to us from the time we wake up in the morning until the time we go to sleep at night. It is that part of our brain that is usually working when we're not absorbed in something else. The other network, the direct action network, is that network in our brain that experiences the world in real time. So when you are in a state of mindfulness focused on one particular thing, you are activating that direct action or direct experience network in your brain. You're not thinking about the future, you're not thinking about the past, you're not thinking about when's this webinar going to be over, or the call you have to make as soon as we're finished. You're in this very moment. And why is that important? It's important because the more we can spend time in that direct experience network, that direct action network, the more we strengthen the circuitry in our brain that builds the capacity in our brain to be more focused on the things we want to focus on. isn't that a valuable thing for a lawyer to have? Mindfulness is not about stopping thoughts. I guess that's one of the most important points that I want to get across. It's not about stopping thoughts. It is about noticing them, just noticing them. So I want to do a quick little exercise with you guys. I do this in live presentations, but we can do it now too. So we're going to have a little mindfulness exercise for about 10 seconds. So what I would ask you to do, and if you already have a mindfulness practice or do yoga or Tai Chi, you may be familiar with these concepts. But I'd like you to just pick something to focus on. Typically it's your breath, but it doesn't have to be your breath. It can be the sensation of your seat in the chair, your feet on the floor, your hands or your arms resting in your lap or on the arm of your chair. I want you to focus on that one thing for just 10 seconds when I say start. If other thoughts come into your mind during those 10 seconds, just come back to what you were wanting to focus on. Okay? Start. Stop. So that was 10 seconds. How did that feel? For most people, it's hard to focus on one thing for even 10 seconds without some other thought floating by like clouds in the sky in your mind. But the moment that you notice that other thought floating by like a cloud in the sky, you came back to the direct experience network. If you were focused on your breath and then thought for a moment about work that you needed to do, in that instant, when you noticed that thought that you did not want to be thinking about at the time and came back to your breath or came back to that point of focus that you had chosen, in that moment, you felt the switch from the default network, thinking about something in the future or some other thought, and what you wanted to be focused on in the moment. Your brain switched networks. And the more you do that, the better you become at noticing those things in your mind, those thoughts that you may have that you don't want to be focused on. And isn't that a valuable tool for any lawyer to have? To be able to focus on that which you choose to focus on when you want to focus on it. And beyond mindfulness being a wonderful tool for a lawyer to have to improve our brain function, I mean, these are just some of the benefits of mindfulness that have been documented, and I give you a couple of sites down there. It reduces stress and anxiety. It increases our self-awareness, our ability to notice and make choices about the things that we're going to focus on and the choices we're going to make in our lives. Protects us against depression. It boosts our immune system, helps us sleep better, lowers blood pressure, improves cognition, reduces internal distractions. And you can start doing this not in, an hour a day or a half hour a day, 5 or 10 minutes or even 2 minutes a day can make a tremendous difference in your life. So let's start living the lesson in terms of taking breaks. Take breaks throughout the day. Set a timer on your computer. If you're wearing a smartwatch, set a timer so that it vibrates and gives you a little nudge to get up and get out of your chair throughout the day. Don't sit for more than 30 minutes. Don't be afraid to add some humor or inspiration, something that makes you feel good and positive. It's going to open up your brain to more creative thinking. Experiment with mindfulness. I offer you 3 resources here. These are 3 apps. One is called Headspace. I'm guessing that a number of you folks on this webinar might be familiar with Headspace. It is one of the best apps out there if you want to start experimenting with mindfulness. The man who created it is a guy named Andy Puddicombe, and he's also written a book called Get Some Headspace. Again, I highly recommend the audiobook. He's a very entertaining reader. He makes mindfulness very accessible and explains why it is so good for us. Aura is another app that is available now that is really great because it has very short exercises, as short as 2 minutes. Anybody can find 2 minutes in the day to start experimenting with a mindfulness practice. I also mentioned Meditation Oasis because it offers a number of guided meditations. I use Meditation Oasis to actually go to sleep sometimes at night. They have great relaxation techniques. And I'll end by saying start now. Don't wait. Choose a lesson. Start now and start doing it now, because a year from now, you may wish you had started today. With that, I'm going to hand things back over to Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Nora. I've picked my lessons and I'm starting today, so you've inspired me.
Awesome.
That was really eye-opening and informative, and we appreciate it. For our audience, as a reminder, if you're a Florida Bar member, note that course number again, 2733R, to self-report your CLE. And please join us next month for another MyCase webinar. Nora, thanks again, and thank you to everyone who is listening to this recording. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.